revenge could happen if there was a betrayal.
Where they are turning everyday border towns into all-out war zones.
Shots were fired as another plane flown by the Mexican Air Force taxied on the runway.
Americans are urged to be cautious in Mexico after the arrest of El Mayo Zambada.
Just when you thought the world of drug cartels couldn't get any more twisted, along comes a curveball that'll make your head spin. El Mayo Zambada, the last of the old guard, has finally been captured after decades on the run, and the infamous Chapitos, El Chapo's kids, seem poised to take full control of the Sinaloa Cartel. But hold on to your hats, because there's a new player emerging from the shadows, and he's about to shake things up in ways we never saw coming. We're talking about a mysterious figure that's been lurking in the background for years, and now he's suddenly stepping into the spotlight. And he's not just another run-of-the-mill narco.
One of El Mayo's sons remains free in Mexico and is wanted by the U.S. government.
That's right, we're talking about El Mayo's own son, and he might just be the key to dethroning the Chapitos and reuniting the fractured Sinaloa Cartel. But here's the kicker. This isn't just about who's running the show in Mexico. This shift could actually ripple across the whole world, changing the game for drug trafficking, international politics, and even that opioid crisis you've been hearing so much about. Things are about to get even more complicated and dangerous than ever before. It's July 2024, and the news many have been waiting to hear for decades is finally breaking worldwide.
We're learning a major arrest was just made. This is quite the big kahuna here.
According to the U.S. Justice Department, the arrest happened this afternoon.
The leader of one of the world's biggest drug cartels has been arrested in Texas.
Ismael El Mayo Zambada, the legendary co-founder of the Sinaloa Cartel, has been captured. The man who managed to evade authorities for decades, outlasting even his infamous partner El Chapo, is finally in custody. It's a seismic event in the world of drug trafficking, and the aftershocks are about to reshape the entire criminal landscape. Now, you might be thinking, great, they got the big bad boss. Problem solved, right? Well, hold on to that thought for a moment.
What I'm hearing so far from the state of Sinaloa is a lot of concern and fear that this is going to result in violence there.
You see, in the world of cartels, every solution comes with a whole new set of problems. So with El Mayo now out of the picture, all eyes are turning to the lost Chapitos, the sons of El Chapo, who've been running their faction of the cartel since their dad got locked up in a supermax prison. These guys aren't exactly known for their subtlety. We're talking flashy lifestyles and a reputation for violence that makes their old man look tame by comparison.
They fed their enemies alive to tigers, electrocuted them, water-boarded them, and shot them at close range with a .50 caliber machine gun.
But here's where it gets interesting. Just when it looks like Los Chapitos are about to take the crown, whispers start circulating about another player entering the game. His name, Ismael Zambada Siqueiros, better known as El Mayito Flaco, meaning the skinny little Mayo.
Y por primera vez se difunde el rostro del heredero de uno de los narcotraficantes más buscados en México. La DEA reveló la foto de Ismael Zambada Siqueiros, alias El Mayito Flaco, de 40 años, quien es hijo de Ismael El Mayo Zambada, líder del cártel de Sinaloa.
Now, if you're scratching your head, wondering why you've never heard of this guy before, don't worry. That's exactly how he likes it. While the Chapitos have been causing quite the stir through their already infamous violent displays of power, El Mayito Flaco's been keeping his head down, learning every aspect of the cartel's operations from the ground up. Think about it like this. Los Chapitos are like those rich kids who inherited daddy's company and are running it into the ground with their partying and bad decisions. But El Mayito Flaco? Well, even though he was born into this lifestyle too, he was more like the quiet, hardworking VP who's been there since day one and who knew where all the bodies were buried, sometimes quite literally. All this time, he's been patiently waiting for his moment to take over, and many are now saying that the moment has finally come.
One of El Mayo's sons remains free in Mexico and is wanted by the U.S. government. In fact, I think the business is going to continue as usual.
Now, you might be wondering, what makes this guy so special? Aren't there tons of narco juniors out there? Well, here's where it gets interesting. El Mayito Flaco isn't just any cartel heir. He's the potential bridge between the old guard and the new one. See, since El Chapo's arrest, and now with El Mayo's capture, the Sinaloa Cartel's been a house divided. On one side, you've got the flashy, violence-prone Chapitos. On the other, you've got the old-school faction loyal to El Mayo. It's like a narco version of the Montagues and Capulets, only with way more firepower and billions of dollars at stake.
These are people who gave to a man, watched him die, and then sent that same batch of to the United States. They know that they are poisoning and killing Americans. They just don't care because they make billions of dollars doing it.
Enter El Mayito Flaco. This guy's got the best of both worlds. He's young enough to relate to the new generation, but raised with the cautious, strategic mindset of his elusive father. It's like he's got one foot in each camp, and that makes him uniquely positioned to potentially reunite the cartel and dethrone Los Chapitos. But here's where it gets really wild. El Mayito Flaco isn't just some puppet his dad was pulling the strings on. No, this guy's got serious chops of his own. According to reports, he's been running major parts of the cartel's operations for years, especially when it comes to the lucrative fentanyl trade. You heard that right. Fentanyl, that synthetic opioid that's been causing havoc across the United States.
And Americans are now more likely to die from an accidental opioid overdose than in a car crash.
To say that the Sinaloa Cartel is knee-deep in that business would be an understatement. They're pretty much responsible for the majority of fentanyl that we've seen getting into the US, and El Mayito Flaco's reportedly one of the masterminds behind it all.
The cartels are trying to make the substance more addictive. They're trying to create more customers, and in the process, they're bringing more death.
Marcaje positivo. Estos aseguramientos son muy frecuentes. Actualmente se realizan de 2 a 3 operativos por semana y en la mayoría de las ocasiones son positivos.
We're not just talking about some kid playing at being a drug lord. We're talking about a major player in a multi-billion-dollar industry that's reshaping the global drug trade, and he's done it all while keeping such a low profile that until recently, most people outside the cartel didn't even know he existed. Now, with his father behind bars, El Mayito Flaco is faced with a choice: step up and claim his inheritance, or stay in the shadows and let Los Chapitos run the show. And make no mistake about it, the decision he makes could have implications far beyond the borders of Mexico. Because here's the thing, if El Mayito Flaco does decide to make his move and challenge Los Chapitos, we could be looking at a new era of organized crime, one where the cartel operates with the efficiency of a multinational corporation, but with the stealth and caution of its old-school roots. So, as we dive deeper into this story, keep this in mind. We're not just talking about a change in leadership, we're witnessing a potential sea change in how one of the world's most powerful criminal organizations operates. The ripple effects of this could be felt from the streets of Culiacan to the corridors of power in Washington, D.C. Now that we've got the backstory, let's dive into what makes El Mayito Flaco such a formidable contender for the Sinaloa Cartel throne, and why he might just be more dangerous than Los Chapitos could ever be. Let's talk about his business model. While the Chapitos have been all about brute force and intimidation, El Mayito Flaco's taking a page out of his old man's playbook. He's all about the art of the deal, preferring to build alliances rather than enemies. Think about it like this. The Chapitos are like that guy at the bar who's always looking for a fight. El Mayito Flaco, he's the smooth operator buying drinks for everyone, making friends, and walking out with all the connections he needs. It's a subtle approach, but in the long run, it's way more effective and way more dangerous. But don't let the smooth talk fool you. This guy's not afraid to get his hands dirty when he needs to. The difference is, he's smart about it. Instead of flashy displays of violence that attract attention, El Mayito Flaco's operations are surgical, precise, and often untraceable. It's like comparing a sledgehammer to a scalpel. Both can do damage, but one's a lot harder to detect. One of his biggest innovations? Diversification. While the Chapitos have been doubling down on traditional drug routes, El Mayito Flaco's been expanding the cartel's portfolio. We're talking everything from cybercrime to human trafficking, and even legitimate businesses used for money laundering.
It actually helps, as crazy as this might sound, to think of them more as a Fortune 500 company.
There's a department for everything, and if one revenue stream dries up, there are a dozen more to pick up the slack. This makes the organization not just more profitable, but also more resilient. Take down one operation, and the rest keep humming along.
Now, one of the reasons that human smuggling is so enticing to drug cartels is that unlike drugs, humans come back.
But perhaps his most significant contribution to the cartel's operations is his approach to the fentanyl trade. We did touch on this earlier, but it's worth diving deeper because this stuff is seriously changing the game. Fentanyl, for those who don't know, is a synthetic opioid that's 50 times stronger than heroin. It's incredibly potent, cheap to produce, and tragically, it's killing thousands of people across the US every year.
I've heard of people overdosing the first time they ever do it.
It's like you either through a friend or you got a contact from someone else, word spreads throughout the grapevine. I mean, it really becomes accessible anywhere you go.
Under El Mayito Flaco's guidance, the Sinaloa Cartel has become one of the largest producers and distributors of fentanyl in the world. But here's where his approach differs from the competition: quality control. Yeah, you heard that right. Quality control in the drug trade. It sounds crazy, but it's true. El Mayito Flaco reportedly instituted strict protocols for fentanyl production. Why? Because he understands that dead customers are bad for business. So by ensuring a more consistent product, he's not only increasing profits, but also, ironically, reducing the number of overdoses. Now, let's be clear, this isn't out of the goodness of his heart. It's pure business. But it shows a level of strategic thinking that's frankly terrifying when you consider the implications. We're talking about a drug lord who's thinking not just about next month's profits, but about the long-term sustainability of his criminal empire. But fentanyl's just the tip of the iceberg. El Mayito Flaco's also been pushing the cartel into new markets. While everyone's been focused on the US, he's been quietly building connections in Europe, Asia, and even Australia.
Now, Europe is facing a massive cocaine crisis, according to law enforcement agencies. Production of the drug has increased by 1/3 in just a year after a slowdown over the pandemic.
So they're constantly looking for new routes, new avenues to get their drugs to wholesale markets and ultimately consumer markets.
Acquistare anche una casa nella Posta Parigi, certo.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Remember how we said he's been keeping a low profile? Well, that extends to his digital footprint too. While the Chapitos can't seem to resist the spotlight, El Mayito Flaco's been leveraging technology in a much smarter way. We're talking encrypted communications, blockchain technology for money transfers, even using AI to predict law enforcement patterns. It's like he's brought the cartel into the 21st century and left everyone else in the dust. This tech-savvy approach doesn't just make him more efficient, it makes him significantly harder to catch. But perhaps the most crucial aspect of El Mayito Flaco's method is his approach to corruption. Now, bribing officials is nothing new in the cartel world, but this guy has elevated it to an art form. Instead of just throwing money at problems, he's building long-term relationships. He's got politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials on the payroll, sure, but he's also investing in their careers, helping them climb the ladder of power. Why? Because the higher they go, the more useful they become to the cartel. It's a strategy that's paying off big time. There have been whispers that El Mayito Flaco's got connections reaching all the way to the highest levels of government, both in Mexico and abroad. If that's true, it would explain how he's managed to operate so effectively while staying off the radar for so long. So, what does all this mean for the future of the Sinaloa Cartel and the global drug trade? Well, if El Mayito Flaco manages to outmaneuver Los Chapitos and take control, we could be looking at a cartel that's more powerful, more influential, and harder to stop than ever before. It's a pretty dark thought, especially when you consider the human cost of the drug trade. But, as we'll see in the next part of our story, the road to the top is far from smooth. El Mayito Flaco's got plenty of obstacles in his path, not least of which are Los Chapitos themselves, and they're not about to give up their father's legacy without a fight. Now that we've got a handle on who El Mayito Flaco is and what makes him tick, let's dive into the boiling pot that is the current state of the Sinaloa Cartel. Because make no mistake, we're looking at a potential narco-civil war here.
The concern is, however, that when you take out a top kingpin like this, that it creates a power vacuum and that there's fighting to sort of fill that and fill their shoes. We saw that after Chapo's capture.
On one side, we've got Los Chapitos, Ivan Archivaldo, and Jesus Alfredo. These guys have been running their faction of the cartel since their dad, El Chapo, got shipped off to a supermax prison in the States. They've got the name, recognition, a loyal following, and a reputation for brutal efficiency. On the other side, there's El Mayito Flaco. He might not have the Guzman name, but he's got the backing of the old guard, his father's connections, and a brain that's always 3 steps ahead of the game. So, what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? Well, in the world of cartels, it usually means blood in the streets. We're already seeing the first shots fired in this power struggle.
Americans are urged to be cautious in Mexico after the arrest of El Mayo Zambada.
And people should maintain awareness of where they're going, especially border cities like Tijuana and Juarez, making sure they're not driving into an active firefight situation.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Unlike previous cartel wars that were all about brute force, this one's being fought on multiple fronts. Sure, there's going to be violence, that's a given, but there's also a war of information, of loyalty, of economic control. El Mayito Flaco, true to form, is playing the long game. Instead of going head-to-head with Los Chapitos, he's slowly but surely eroding their power base. He's allegedly poaching their best lieutenants, cutting deals with their suppliers, and even, if rumors are to be believed, feeding information to law enforcement to disrupt Chapito operations.
We could have a rearranging at the top of criminal structures for newly opened spaces. Revenge could happen if there was a betrayal.
The Chapitos, on the other hand, are responding the only way they know how, with overwhelming force. They're doubling down on their territories, tightening their grip on local politicians and law enforcement, and making examples of anyone they suspect of disloyalty. But here's where it gets scary. This isn't just playing out in Mexico. The battle for control of the Sinaloa Cartel is having ripple effects across the globe. In Chicago, longtime distribution hubs are choosing sides. In Colombia, coca farmers are hedging their bets on who'll come out on top. Even as far away as Australia, dealers are picking teams in this high-stakes game of narco thrones. And caught in the middle of all this? The ordinary people of Sinaloa and beyond. Because let's not forget, while these cartel bigwigs are duking it out for control, it's regular folks who are paying the price. We're talking about increased violence in the streets, more drugs flooding communities, and a climate of fear that's becoming all too familiar.
Well, Mexican drug cartels are not shy about making their presence known along the southern border to the point where they are turning everyday border towns into all-out war zones.
The town has become a place where these two gangs clash.
So, who's going to come out on top in this narco Game of Thrones? It's too early to say for sure, but one thing's certain, whoever wins, it's not going to be pretty for the rest of us. Let's start with the obvious, the drugs. The Sinaloa Cartel, whether under Los Chapitos or El Mayito Flaco, is still going to be pumping out massive amounts of narcotics, but the way they do it, where they send it, and what kinds of drugs they focus on, that could all change depending on who ends up on top. If Los Chapitos keep control, expect business as usual, lots of cocaine, heroin, meth, and fentanyl flooding into the US. But if El Mayito Flaco takes over, we might see a bigger push into markets in Europe and Asia. And it's not just about what drugs are being sold, but how they're being sold. El Mayito Flaco's tech-savvy approach could revolutionize drug distribution. We're talking drone deliveries, cryptocurrency transactions, and everything in between. But drugs are just the tip of the iceberg. Let's talk politics for a second. Both Los Chapitos and El Mayito Flaco have their fingers in a lot of political pies, but they play the game very differently. Los Chapitos tend to go for the blunt approach, bribes, threats, and the occasional nation. El Mayito Flaco, on the other hand, is all about subtle influence. He's the guy funding political campaigns, setting up legitimate businesses as fronts, and slowly infiltrating every level of government.
I'm talking about corrupt politicians, I'm talking about the money laundering cells, the enforcement cells, the logistical cells.
If El Mayito Flaco comes out on top, we could be looking at a whole new level of narco politics. We're talking about a cartel leader who doesn't just buy off politicians, but shapes policy from deep within. Imagine a world where drug laws, border policies, and international trade agreements are being influenced by one of the world's most wanted men. That's a pretty scary thought, isn't it? But perhaps the biggest global implication is what this power struggle means for the future of organized crime as a whole. The Sinaloa Cartel isn't just any criminal organization, it's a trendsetter. Other cartels, mafias, and gangs around the world look to Sinaloa as a model. If El Mayito Flaco's more corporate, tech-savvy approach proves successful, then you can bet that other criminal groups will follow suit.
But you also have a very, very powerful and very violent drug organization by the name of Jalisco New Generation Cartel.
We could be looking at a future where organized crime is less about street thugs and more about white-collar criminals with MBAs. On the flip side, if Los Chapitos manage to hold on to power, it might signal a return to the old-school narco ways, more violence, more flashy displays of wealth, and a more traditional approach to the drug trade. Either way, law enforcement agencies around the world are going to have their work cut out for them. They're not just fighting a drug war anymore. They're up against a criminal empire that's constantly evolving, always one step ahead of the game. So, where do we go from here? As the dust settles on El Mayo's capture and the power struggle between El Mayito Flaco and Los Chapitos heats up, what can we expect in the coming months and years? Well, for starters, expect more violence. As much as El Mayito Flaco prefers to operate in the shadows, a transition of power in the cartel world is never peaceful. We're likely to see more clashes, more mysterious disappearances, and unfortunately, more civilian casualties as this narco-civil war plays out. On the law enforcement front, agencies around the world are going to be scrambling to adapt, whether it's dealing with El Mayito Flaco's high-tech approach or the Chapitos' brute force tactics. The good guys are going to have to seriously up their game. But here's the thing, no matter who comes out on top, the fundamental problems that allow cartels to thrive aren't going away. As long as there's demand for drugs, as long as there's poverty pushing people into the narco life, as long as there's corruption in governments, well, there's always going to be someone ready to step up and be the next drug lord. So, what's the solution? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Some say legalization is the answer, taking the profit out of the drug trade. Others argue for harsher penalties, more enforcement. And then there are those who say we need to address the root causes: poverty, lack of education, corruption. The truth is, there's no easy answer. But one thing's for sure, the capture of El Mayo and the rise of El Mayito Flaco marks a new chapter in the war on drugs. Whether it's a chapter that leads to a happy ending or a darker turn in the story, well, only time will tell. As we wrap up this deep dive into the world of the Sinaloa Cartel, it's important to remember that behind all the power plays and billion-dollar deals, there's a very real human cost. Families torn apart by addiction, communities living in fear, lives lost to violence. That's the true legacy of the drug trade. So, the next time you hear about cartel arrests or drug busts on the news, remember, it's not just about cops and robbers. It's about a complex web of power, money, and human suffering that spans the globe. And as long as that web exists, there will always be someone like El Mayito Flaco waiting in the wings, ready to take control and keep the machine running. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Hey, thanks for watching. Who do you think will make the cut as Sinaloa's new commander-in-chief? Feel free to voice your opinion down in the comment section below. Also, if you've enjoyed this video, then make sure to give it a thumbs up and to subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, stay safe.